Hello, everybody. This is C. Michael Morrison, or as my friends call me, Mike. I'm here in my podcast studio. Normally, I would be in here talking about all things Star Trek on my Star Trek and Philosophy podcast, Metatrex, on Trek.fm. I co host that along with my esteemed colleague, Zachary Fruling. But today, I'm here for a very, very special reason. Today is National Read Aloud Day. And so I'm going to read aloud from my young adult science fiction fantasy novel, Hannah Goodheart and the Guardian of Time. I started writing Hannah Goodheart and the Guardian of Time in late 2015. In October this past year, 2019, it was released, published by Fawkes Press. It's, as I said, a young adult science fiction fantasy novel. It's a time travel book. How cool is that? It features a young girl who discovers an artifact on the eve of her 13th birthday. And at first, she thinks it might be a trinket or some type of piece of jewelry, and she quickly finds out that it's so much more. And that's when the adventure begins. I'm going to be reading today from the second chapter of the book, entitled "Nothing of Consequence." I love this chapter because it takes place in an antique store. Very cool places, by the way. If you've never visited an antique store or gone to a flea market, you should totally go do that. They're full of such wonderful things, and everything there has a history and a story to tell. So definitely check out an antique store or a flea market if you've never had the opportunity to do that. Again, this takes place in Mr. Hoyce's Antique Emporium. And so Hannah says, approaching the door, I fed on my father's confidence. I too was feeling sure that if anyone could, Mr. Hoyce would be able to shed some light on and estimate the value of my little treasure. Yes, I'd begun to think of it as mine. The anticipation was swelling to the point I felt like I would burst. Stay cool, I said to myself as Daddy opened the door. Walking inside, I was immediately caught up in the eclectic atmosphere and started scanning the myriad of items in the store as me and my dad made our way to the counter. A beautiful wood and glass display case held a treasury of jewelry and coins next to an ornate walnut counter where Mr. Hoyce stood waiting at the center of the premises. Daddy extended his right hand to shake, but the middle aged man stepped from behind the counter and embraced my father, much to my surprise. Charles, my dear friend, he exclaimed in a thick accent. Not quite as tall as my dad, Mr. Hoyce had thick black hair, just a little long, but neatly combed back, and a full dark beard. Everything about him was polished and well manicured, right down to his tailored suit. He had deep set, dark brown eyes that almost seemed to look through you. His smile was broad and bright against his beard and olive skin. Daddy looked down at me with a proud smile. You remember my daughter, Hannah? Ah, yes, Mr. Hoyce said, reaching for my hand. What a beautiful young lady you're growing to be. I hardly recognized you. Much different than the little girl you were the last time you visited my establishment. He raised my hand and bowed to kiss it gently. I immediately blushed as I looked down and brushed my bangs aside, feeling slightly odd about what I thought was an unusual gesture. And equally modest, he added with a wink, as he must have noticed my slight embarrassment to his compliment. The shopkeeper turned once again to my dad, placing his hand on his shoulder. I'm so glad you called me this morning, Charles, he said. I'm eager to see your item. It sounded most intriguing. Daddy wasted no time. It was actually Hannah who found it. She was stargazing with friends in a field near our home. I jumped into the conversation, extending the envelope and placing it in his hand. I thought I saw a light, but it must have been reflecting starlight or something, I said enthusiastically. Hoyce looked at the envelope. His gaze was intense, and his attention was singular. What kind of light did you see? He inquired with a hint of suspicion. I looked up at my dad and then at Mr. Hoyce, whose eyes were fixed squarely on me. It was bluish. I may have It may have been the streaking lights from the meteor shower playing tricks on my eyes. Once I got up to it, the light was gone. Daddy chimed in. You'll see it's too small to have a light source of any kind, he said. It's showing the stress of exposure, but I'm hoping you might be able to clean it up and give us an idea what exactly it is. Mr. Hoyst drew in a breath as he carefully opened the envelope. He reached into the pouch and gently took hold of the cube, pulling it out ever so carefully. He held it delicately as he stepped back behind the counter, walking as though he were carrying something extremely fragile. Reaching down with his free hand, he pulled out a small cherry wood box and opened it to retrieve a jeweler's loupe, using it to meticulously examine my find. Remarkable, he said under his breath as he slowly turned the object in his fingers while studying it intensely. Any thoughts? My dad asked. Mr. Hoyce raised his eyes and looked up at the two of us, who were watching with curiosity. You are correct that it is very distressed from exposure, soiled. How long do you suppose it had been left in the elements? He asked. I looked once again at my dad, who was shaking his head, trying to guess what the answer might be. I'm not sure. Months, years, it's hard to say, Daddy replied. Maybe centuries, I exclaimed, trying to contribute. Maybe it's some treasure left by conquistadors centuries ago. I immediately felt that my enthusiasm had spilled out, maybe a bit too much, but Mr. Hoy smiled politely, although he didn't seem amused with my conquistador theory. Can it be cleaned up? Daddy asked quickly, noticing Mr. Hoyce's reaction to my whimsical idea. Mr. Hoyce placed a polishing cloth on the counter and set the cube on it with great care. Yes, he said, I believe it can. If you want to leave it here, I can clean and polish it. Once I'm done restoring its luster, I should be able to give you a better idea what it is and as well as its value. I turned to my dad, whose eyes remained on the cube. Daddy, I said, I didn't want to have to say anything else. He knew that I was opposed to the idea of leaving it there. I gave him a long look. I wasn't altogether certain why. I just didn't feel good about leaving it with the antique dealer. I could tell the idea didn't sit well with my father either. Daddy remained focused on the item and didn't acknowledge my cue. Mr. Hoyce was beginning to appear a little impatient as he waited for my dad to say something. His dark eyes glared at my dad, and his finger began to tap the counter gently. It wouldn't take too much to clean, would it? You wouldn't mind if we stay and watch? Mr. Hoyce stiffened, then smiled as he relaxed and began to pull out some tools. Not at all, Charles, my friend, he said with his thick accent. He took the loupe in hand and again quickly looked at the cube, checking each side, rotating the tiny box gingerly between his thumb and forefinger, as though he were hunting for something. Feeling a little less anxious, my eyes began to wander, scanning the treasure trove of unusual items contained within the walls of the antique store. Sitting next to the wooden counter where Mr. Hoyce had begun to work, a somewhat tattered hardcover book with a uniquely embossed cover drew my eye. As though pulled toward it by an unknown force, I began gravitating in its direction. Just as I was about to touch it, Mr. Hoyce's voice pierced through my near hypnosis. It is the oldest translation I have yet to come across, Mr. Hoyce said, not taking his eye or attention from the work. Works and Days, the finest literary achievement by the great Greek poet Hesiodus. My hand stopped cold. I sensed old equaled expensive. I quickly put my hands behind my back and diverted my attention back to the counter. Mr. Hoyce continued to remove bits of soil and dirt patches from the cube. Oh, don't be shy, my dear. Books were meant to be touched with searching hands, read by curious eyes, and digested by the inquiring mind, Mr. Hoyce said. It's not for sale at any price, but I welcome you to look at it, he continued, looking up from his work for only a brief second. Yes, there's something about the feel of paper in your hand, the satisfaction one gets from turning a page. You just cannot appreciate such experiences with electronic media. Well, that's from the second chapter of Hannah Goodheart and the Guardian of Time, published by Fawkes Press, available everywhere books are sold. What's the antique dealer going to have to say about Hannah's little treasure? Well, you're going to have to read the rest of the second chapter and the entirety of Hannah Goodheart and the Guardian of Time to find out what it's all about. Hey, check me out on social media. I'm on Facebook at Guardian of Time Book. I'm also on Instagram, cmichael1701. On Twitter, I'm at cmichael1701. You can also visit my website, hannahgoodheart.com. Be sure to check out my friends Fawkes Press as well on Twitter at Fawkes Press, Instagram. They're also at Fawkes Press. Hey, everybody, enjoy a great book on National Read Aloud Day. Read a book. Have a great day.